The Lebanese Civil War was a multifaceted civil war in Lebanon, lasting from 1975 to 1990 and resulting in an estimated 120,000 fatalities. As of 2012, approximately 76,000 people remain displaced within Lebanon. There was also an exodus of almost 1 million people from Lebanon as a result of the war. Before the war, Lebanon was multi-sectarian, with Sunnis and Christians being the majorities on the coastal cities, Shias being mainly based in the south and the Beqaa to the east, with the mountain populations being in their majority Druze and Christian. The government of Lebanon had been run under a significant influence of the elites among the Maronite Christians. The link between politics and religion had been reinforced under the mandate of the French colonial powers from 1920 to 1943, and the parliamentary structure favored a leading position for the Christians. However, the country had a large Muslim population and many pan-Arabist and left-wing groups opposed the pro-Western government. The establishment of the State of Israel and the displacement of 100,000 Palestinian refugees to Lebanon during the 1948 and 1967 exoduses contributed to shifting the demographic balance in favor of the Muslim population. The Cold War had a powerful disintegrative effect on Lebanon, which was closely linked to the polarization that preceded the 1958 political crisis. Since Maronites sided with the West while leftist and pan-Arab groups sided with Soviet-aligned Arab countries, fighting between Maronite and Palestinian forces began in 1975, then leftist, pan-Arabist and Muslim Lebanese groups formed an alliance with the Palestinians. During the course of the fighting, alliances shifted rapidly and unpredictably. Furthermore, foreign powers, such as Israel and Syria, became involved in the war and fought alongside different factions. Peacekeeping forces, such as the multinational force in Lebanon and UNIFIL, were also stationed in Lebanon. The 1989 Taif Agreement marked the beginning of the end of the fighting. In January 1989, a committee appointed by the Arab League began to formulate solutions to the conflict. In March 1991, Parliament passed an amnesty law that pardoned all political crimes prior to its enactment. In May 1991, the militias were dissolved, with the exception of Hezbollah, while the Lebanese armed forces began to slowly rebuild as Lebanon's only major non-sectarian institution. Religious tensions between Sunnis and Shias remained after the war. Background: colonial rule and 1860 civil war between Druze and Maronites erupted in the Ottoman province of Mount Lebanon, which had been divided between them in 1842. It resulted in the death of about 10,000 Christians and the victory of the Druze. World War I was hard for the Lebanese. While the rest of the world was occupied with the World War, the people in Lebanon were suffering from a famine that would last nearly 4 years. With the defeat and dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, Turkish rule ended. France took control of the area under the French Mandate for Syria and the Lebanon under the League of Nations. The French created the state of Greater Lebanon as a safe haven for the Maronites, but included a large Muslim population within the borders. In 1926, Lebanon was declared a republic, and a constitution was adopted. However, the constitution was suspended in 1932. Various factions sought unity with Syria or independence from the French. In 1934, the country's first census was conducted. In 1936, the Maronite Phalange Party was founded by Pierre Gemayel. Independence, World War II and the 1940s brought great change to Lebanon and the Middle East. Lebanon was promised independence, and on the 22nd of November 1943, during World War II, it was achieved. Free French troops, who had invaded Lebanon in 1941 to rid Beirut of the Vichy French forces, left the country in 1946. The Maronites assumed power over the country and economy. A parliament was created, in which both Muslims and Christians each had a set quota of seats. Accordingly, the president was to be a Maronite, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim and the Speaker of Parliament a Shia Muslim. The United Nations partition plan for Palestine in late 1947 led to civil war in Palestine, the end of mandatory Palestine, and the Israeli Declaration of Independence on 14 May 1948. With nationhood, the ongoing civil war was transformed into a state conflict between Israel and the Arab states, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. All this led to Palestinian refugees crossing the border into Lebanon. Palestinians would go on to play a very important role in future Lebanese civil conflicts, while the establishment of Israel radically changed the region around Lebanon. In July 1958, Lebanon was threatened by a civil war between Maronite Christians and Muslims. President Camille Chamoun had attempted to break the stranglehold on Lebanese politics exercised by traditional political families in Lebanon. These families maintained their electoral appeal by cultivating strong client-patron relations with their local communities. Although he succeeded in sponsoring alternative political candidates to enter the elections in 1957, causing the traditional families to lose their positions, these families then embarked upon a war with Chamoun, referred to as the War of the Pashas. In previous years, tensions with Egypt had escalated in 1956 when the non-aligned president, Camille Chamoun, did not break off diplomatic relations with the Western powers that attacked Egypt during the Suez Crisis, angering Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. This was during the Cold War, and Chamoun has often been called pro-Western, though he had signed several trade deals with the Soviet Union. However, Nasser had attacked Chamoun because of his suspected support for the U.S.-led Baghdad Pact. Nasser felt that the pro-Western Baghdad Pact posed a threat to Arab nationalism. However, President Chamoun looked to regional pacts to ensure protection from foreign armies. Lebanon historically had a small cosmetic army that was never effective in defending Lebanon's territorial integrity, and this is why in later years the PLO guerrilla factions had found it easy to enter Lebanon and set up bases, as well as take over army barracks on the border with Israel as early as 1968. U.S.A. documents the early skirmishes which saw the army not only lose control over its barracks to the PLO but also lost many soldiers. Even prior to this, President Chamoun was aware of the country's vulnerability to outside forces, but his Lebanese pan-Arabist Sunni Muslim Prime Minister Rashid Karimi supported Nasser in 1956 and 1958. Lebanese Muslims pushed the government to join the newly created United Arab Republic, a country formed out of the unification of Syria and Egypt. While the majority of Lebanese and especially the Maronites wanted to keep Lebanon as an independent nation with its own independent parliament, President Camille feared the toppling of his government and asked for U.S. intervention. At the time the United States was engaged in the Cold War, Chamoun asked for assistance, proclaiming that communists were going to overthrow his government. Chamoun was responding not only to the revolt of former political bosses, but also to the fact that both Egypt and Syria had taken the opportunity to deploy proxies into the Lebanese conflict. Thus the Arab National Movement, led by George Habash and later to become the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and a faction of the PLO, were deployed to Lebanon by Nasser. The ANM were a clandestine militia implicated in attempted coups against both the Jordanian monarchy and the Iraqi president throughout the 1950s at Nasser's bidding. The founding members of Fatah, including Yasser Arafat and Khalil Wazir, also flew to Lebanon to use the insurrection as a means by which a war could be fomented toward Israel. They participated in the fighting by directing armed forces against the government security in the city of Tripoli, according to U.S.A.'s work. In that year, President Chamoun was unable to convince the Maronite army commander, Fuad Shahab, to use the armed forces against Muslim demonstrators. Fearing that getting involved in internal politics would split his small and weak multi-confessional force, the Phalange militia came to the president's aid instead to bring a final end to the road blockades which were crippling the major cities. Encouraged by its efforts during this conflict, later that year, principally through violence in the successor general strikes in Beirut, the Phalange achieved what journalists dubbed the counter-revolution. By their actions, the Phalangists brought down the government of Prime Minister Karimi and secured for their leader, Pierre Gemayel, a position in the four-man cabinet that was subsequently formed. However, estimates of the Phalange's membership by U.S.A and other academic sources put them at a few thousand. Non-academic sources tend to inflate the Phalange's membership. What should be kept in mind was that this insurrection was met with widespread disapproval by many Lebanese who wanted no part in the regional politics, and many young men aided the Phalange in their suppression of the insurrection, especially as many of the demonstrators were little more than proxy forces hired by groups such as the ANM and Fatah founders, as well as being hired by the defeated parliamentary bosses. Demographic tensions during the 1960s. Lebanon was relatively calm, but this would soon change. Fatah and other Palestinian Liberation Organization factions had long been active among the 400,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanese camps. Throughout the 1960s, the Center for Armed Palestinian Activities had been in Jordan, but they were forced to relocate after being evicted by King Hussein during the Black September in Jordan. Fatah and other Palestinian groups had attempted to mount a coup in Jordan by incentivizing a split in the Jordanian army, something that the ANM had attempted to do a decade earlier by Nasser's bidding. Jordan, however, responded and expelled the forces into Lebanon. When they arrived, they created a state within the state. This action wasn't welcomed by the Lebanese government, and this shook Lebanon's fragile sectarian climate. Solidarity to the Palestinians was expressed through the Lebanese Sunni Muslims, but with the aim to change the political system from one of consensus amongst different sects towards one where their power share would increase. Certain groups in the Lebanese national movement wished to bring about a more secular and democratic order, but as this group increasingly included Islamist groups, encouraged to join by the PLO, the more progressive demands of the initial agenda was dropped by January 1976. Islamists did not support a secular order in Lebanon and wished to bring about rule by Muslim clerics. U.S.A documents these events, especially the role of Fatah and the Tripoli Islamist movement known as Tawhid, in changing the agenda being pursued by many groups, including communists. This ragtag coalition has often been referred to as left-wing, but many participants were actually very conservative religious elements that did not share any broader ideological agenda. Rather, they were brought together by the short-term goal of overthrowing the established political order, each motivated by their own grievances. These forces enabled the PLO, Fatah to transform the western part of Beirut into its stronghold. The PLO had taken over the heart of Sidon and Tyre in the early 1970s. It controlled great swathes of South Lebanon, in which the indigenous Shiite population had to suffer the humiliation of passing through PLO checkpoints, and now they had worked their way by force into Beirut. The PLO did this with the assistance of so-called volunteers from Libya and Algeria shipped in through the ports it controlled, as well as a number of Sunni Lebanese groups who had been trained and armed by PLO, Fatah, and encouraged to declare themselves as separate militias. However, as Rex Brennan makes clear in his publication on the PLO, these militias were nothing more than shop fronts, or in Arabic, dakakan, for Fatah, armed gangs with no ideological foundation and no organic reason for their existence save the fact their individual members were put on PLO, Fatah, payroll. The strike of fishermen at Sidon in February 1975 could also be considered the first important episode that set off the outbreak of hostilities. That event involved a specific issue: the attempt of former President Camille Chamoun to monopolize fishing along the coast of Lebanon. The injustices perceived by the fishermen evoked sympathy from many Lebanese and reinforced the resentment and antipathy that were widely felt against the state and the economic monopolies. The demonstrations against the fishing company were quickly transformed into a political action supported by the political left and their allies in the Palestine Liberation Organization. The state tried to suppress the demonstrators, and a sniper reportedly killed a popular figure in the city, the former mayor of Sidon, Maruf Saad. Many non-academic sources claim a government sniper killed Saad. However, there is no evidence to support such a claim, and it appears that whoever had killed him had intended that what began as a small and quiet demonstration to evolve into something more. The sniper targeted Saad right at the end of the demonstration as it was dissipating. Farid Kazan, sourcing the local histories of Sidon academics and eyewitnesses, gives a rundown of the puzzling events of the day that based on their research. Other interesting facts that Kazan reveals, based on the Sidon academics' work, including that Saad was not in dispute with the fishing consortium made up of Yugoslav nationals. In fact, the Yugoslavian representatives in Lebanon had negotiated with the Fishermen's Union to make the fishermen shareholders in the company. The company offered to modernize the fishermen's equipment and buy their catch, give their fishermen's a union an annual subsidy. Saad, as a union representative, was offered a place on the company's board too. There has been some speculation that Saad's attempts to narrow the differences between the fishermen and the consortium, and his acceptance of a place on the board made him a target of attack by the conspirator who sought a full conflagration around the small protest. The events in Sidon were not contained for long. The government began to lose control of the situation in 1975.